I think one of the things that surprised me the most, because you've known a Porter your whole life and been telling stories for 30 years, but as a writer brought in on the project, it strikes me that here is a man who knew Joseph Smith before the first vision. Church history sort of starts with the first vision, and everything that we know about it is after that. But here's a boy who was just his next door neighbor, and I can only imagine what it would be like to have this young man who's 8 years older, 7.5 years older, who invites you over and says, I have this amazing experience that I want to share with you. And he starts speaking of angels, he speaks of the gold plates, he tells the story of the Nephites. Imagine what it would be like to be a young boy and to hear those words from the prophet's mouth literally as they were happening.
Porter, with the stories that Joseph told, the experiences he was having with the events of the Restoration, were a deep impression on young Porter's mind. And he gains his first testimony at the mouth of Joseph Smith.
Porter's enduring legacy is of a man who was devoted to Joseph Smith, who protected him until the last moment when ordered by Joseph Smith to withdraw. I think the prophet had in mind what had to happen, the martyrdom, and that was a launching point for the church.
His idea of protecting the church was one of protecting it from its enemies, from within and also from without.
So he ordered Porter away, but Porter immediately transferred his allegiance to Brigham Young, to the church, and in a sense, he was able to empower the church to make the move to the West.
There are those who think that Porter's life was a life of contradiction.
I know that you have opinions on it. I think it is. I mean, here's a guy who was a hard drinker and who went to church every Sunday, who protected and loved the prophets, and yet who could shoot an Indian who had stolen a horse and didn't confess to it, seemingly without remorse. I mean, I see that as a lot happening in a single man's mind.
There's one interesting story where he's visiting a particular ward on a Sunday, and it's when they are blessing and naming children. And a man by the name of Merrill asked him to bless and name his son, so he named his son Porter Merrill. And ever since then, there's been a Porter Merrill in that same family. He was a very private man that did not seek the limelight. Reporters that wrote about him, he often resented what they printed. In fact, there are occasions where he verbally and physically confronted reporters who wrote negative about him.
And here we are
doing the same thing.
Telling the story.
Now, what do I think about it? What do I think about? To tell you, Blake.
One of the things that didn't get talked about a lot is, in my research, what I found, I think the man had an unusual and uncanny ability to read people. And that seems to be kind of glossed over in everything. He was a man who was illiterate, couldn't read or write, but yet he was tremendously successful in business. So that takes a lot of intuitiveness.
Well, from what I understand, because of the unique blessing that he received at the hands of Joseph Smith, that if he would remain true and faithful to his covenants and to the church, no blade nor bullet could harm him. Porter interpreted that to mean that he couldn't be killed by someone else's hand. And really, didn't that lead to a lot of the gun battles that he had? If I'm a gunslinger in the Old West, and I can be the guy who can kill the man who can't be killed, I would become instantly famous.
Outside the church, the biggest misconception is that he's Brigham's destroying angel, chief of the Danites, chief executioner of the church. All of those are from the anti-Mormon literature. They're a myth. One time at one of our book signings, a nice, well-dressed, gray-haired lady walked by and simply said, he was just a hitman for Joseph Smith. And I politely said, ma'am, he was not. If you'll read the book, perhaps you'll find the truth. No, he was just a hitman for Joseph Smith. And I said, well, ma'am, then who did he kill for him? And she couldn't answer and walked off in somewhat of a huff, unfortunately. I didn't mean to embarrass her or to insult her, but when you make an accusation that he was a hitman for the church, good. Tell me who he killed for the church.
Now, given that this was the sign of his protection, did he ever cut his hair?
Just like the biblical Samson, who had a Delilah, Porter had his own Delilah, but we like his Delilah a lot better. Her name was Agnes Smith. She was the widow of Don Carlos, the younger brother of Joseph Smith. Porter, in one of his trips to California, found her there. She was in dire straits. She just recovered from typhoid fever. She had 2 small children to take care of, and the fever had caused all of her hair to fall out. Having empathy for her, as a final token of devotion to the Smith family, he went to a barber, had his hair cut, took the hair to a wig maker in San Francisco, and made a wig for her. Now, so you can see Brigham's destroying angel knocking on the door of a young widow, box, wrapping paper, ribbons, and offering her his most prized possession, a wig made of his own hair. Now, he did go into hiding after that till his hair grew back. He wasn't going to face outlaws in the West without his long hair, but he also jokingly once said that after he cut his hair, he could no longer control his desire for strong drink and cussing, 2 things he was pretty good at.
Were there any scars on his body? People are really curious about that.
No. When he died, they did perform an autopsy to see the cause of death and decided it was natural causes of heart attack. But one of his daughters, who helped prepare the body for burial, had washed his vest, and she saw in it many bullet holes. But as they cleaned his body to be redressed for burial, she noticed that there was no bullet wound, knife wound, no scars on his body. As I have studied my great-great-grandfather's life, from childhood to his death, his undying loyalty to Joseph Smith, his belief in Joseph Smith, his loyalty to the church as a whole, is something that has impressed my mind and gives me a greater and stronger testimony of the truth of the gospel.
As I got to know him, I came to decide that he's definitely a role model of devotion. He accepted the truth of the gospel, he accepted Joseph Smith, and then he gave his life defending that gospel. I think that's it. I think that for those of us who are interested in business, he was one of the most successful business owners in the state of Utah. Some men at the time said that he was the wealthiest man. Most people are unaware of that.
Yeah.
And so he was a multifaceted man. I think that he would be a compelling character in any period of time and in any setting that he had been placed.
The one question that I would like to ask is, tell me about Joseph Smith. Porter knew the prophet from childhood until his martyrdom at Carthage. I would want to know his perspective, his personal friendship with the prophet. Now, there are myriad of questions you'd like to ask.
But you only get one.
I only got one, but that's what I would want to know. Tell me about Joseph. How about you? What would you like to know?
As a lover of history and a student of history, I would ask him, was it worth it? Was everything that you went through to establish his church in the middle of the desert, the middle of the wilderness, was it worth it?
I think he would answer yes,
I think so, but I'd love to hear how he answered it.
in more than one sentence.